So I guess, with chatbots right now, user experience is really at the fundamental core, right? Looking at linguistics and trying to marry that with the technology. And, I think there are a lot of expectations right now across the board where people are like, oh, it's a Siri and it can answer everything. And on the other end of the spectrum, people are like, no, compartmentalized use cases. So even since 2016 with the Microsoft Research Chatbot Conference to 2017 to 2018, where do you think people should be sort of placing their expectations in the interim versus what is possible in the future?
So I think what's interesting, and I kind of love this, is because human language is so fundamental, we don't even really think of how difficult it is. So I've been really inspired by these books. There's a great author named Steven Pinker, and he writes a lot about language understanding. So I was reading it thinking, we'll try to model some of our software, not inspired from AI researchers, but maybe some cognitive psychologists. It's like people who've really been thinking about the human brain and language. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is so hard. So, we have a long way to go. And I think reading some of those books can really teach you how irregular language is, how personal it is, how sometimes if you're having a really tough negotiation, you want to be ambiguous. So, you're asking someone out on a date. You don't want to be super explicit, maybe to give people an hour big business deal, right? You kind of, for every important integration, sometimes you don't want that. It's good intentionally to be a little bit ambiguous. So I think we just need to remember that to understand human language is probably to understand the human mind. And, sometimes you barely know what you're saying, much less understanding what someone else is saying. So we should just, but given that, the apps that we have today, the way that we talk to companies, the way companies interact with customers, the way you might get your job done at school or at work, we can make it so much easier and better. And by language controlling things, even something super simple like having Alexa play music for you, which is really a very, very simple command, feels like magic because today you've got to go through all these steps. So I think one of the interesting things about language is it lets you kind of cut right to that thing that you want. So if I was to interrupt myself and say pizza, you just follow along. You wouldn't be failure. You'd just be like, okay, what's she going to talk about now? And I could just switch topics or I could tell a joke and you wouldn't be like, So I think if you think of apps today, they are beginning to be written more as little components that you can deep link or a web page. You can deep link right to that URL that you want. And so I think part of a chat, what is a chatbot really? It's an app that is conversation enabled that understands conversation or some of what you're inputting, and it lets you kind of deep link right into that answer or that part of the application that you're interested in. That would be a good user experience, I think.
Absolutely. So maybe we'll take this a little bit back to some of your background, because we did also see that you used to be sort of an early UX researcher at Apple back in the day. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on how you sort of see the, field of UX sort of evolve, from more conventional UX best practices to chatbots best practices, where the UX isn't, I wouldn't say it's exactly defined yet as to what's good, what's bad, what works, what doesn't. So definitely would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I worked at Apple on QuickTime VR. So a lot of these stitching, and I was an architect before that. So I had a whole nother career before. And I think maybe one example that's kind of fun to think about is if you think of the web browser, it took us a while. We had web pages and they were kind of a mess. And then there was this toolbar at the top with a big back button. And even today in your operating system, you can't always just go back to the place you were. And on the web browser, it's really important they have a back button. And without it, I think the experience would be kind of bad, right? You can't even imagine a web browser without being able to go back to where you were. But in conversation, if I was to say to you, go back, what would you say, right? What did you say that was just last? You'd be like, I don't even remember what I just said. And I think it's because in conversation, you're always going forward. So just like to your GPS, you don't say to your GPS, go back, because it's you're driving forward. Right. And so time is always moving in conversation. So I just think time and the fact that you're always moving forward in an interaction means that your very basic user experience design is different. You don't have back really in conversation. You might say repeat, And then I would be like, what didn't you understand? And I'm always still going forward. So it's super fun, I think, thinking about UX because it kind of takes it back to basic principles. Sometimes the user experience gets more and more complex. And sometimes then we miss these really basic things that your software could do better, like just answer the question that you want answered, right? Or understand voice. And there's so many things we could do. Understand if you're laughing or you're confused or it's your first time and you're a new user or you've already interacted 100 times before. So why isn't it different? I mean, I always think email, gosh, it's designed, the client is the same for every single user. But, I'm like one of these terrible, like a gazillion million unread messages type person, but there's other people. So just giving me that number just always makes me feel bad. Like, if you have over 500, I have like thousands of unread messages. Like, it's not important to tell me that I have like X number of thousand precise how many unread messages I have. So we just need to, basically, I think by going back to the basic of language and input, just even the keyboard, it understands words that you type and gives you suggestions. It's such a luxury for us because otherwise we keep making the UX more and more complex. And I think at some point people are like, just boil it back down to the beginning. Like, let's make it simple again. So it's fun. Like, we're in a moment where we can say, can AI just make it simple again? Because we've cluttered it up, and I'm sure we'll go back and forth, but I think that's the attraction to artificial intelligence and conversation. It's like, I know how to talk. So hopefully if I know how to talk or converse, like the UI can work for me instead of me always having to adapt to learning some new system.
Right. It lowers the learning curve.
Yeah. And this is why I think even for a lot of the speech interfaces, you see like elderly folks and kids, like it's just so natural for them. We've learned, like we have bad ski habits or something, right? So we have to kind of unlearn some things. But like I gave my parents a speaker and they were just like, they could play music that they hadn't heard forever. Of course, they have a computer. They could do that too. But they just, it was too much trouble. And so I love that just these basic, simple things that people want to do. It just makes it so much more accessible to so many people still. And we just have so much work to do still to make software accessible and easier to use and just more part of everything you do.